Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the TCLF One-on-One Series. Through the One-on-One Series, we aim to interact with the best legal professionals from India and around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have a very interesting episode which will be focused towards energy law and particularly investments in the energy sector and what is the role of Energy Charter Treaty and its secretariat. And we have none other than the investment expert Ishita Pant, who works at the Energy Charter Secretariat in Brussels, Belgium, to speak with us. She, as I have told you already, is an investment expert and also leads the flagship publication of the Secretariat, which is focused towards assessing the risks in the energy sector worldwide. Ma'am, it's an honor to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Shashwat, for inviting me to the Contemporary Law Forum.
Uh, Ma'am, let's start by talking about your journey as a lawyer. Why did you choose to become a lawyer? What inspired you?
Well, to be honest, it wasn't like I had a kind of epiphany that I want to be a lawyer. It wasn't the first thing that I wanted to be. I think it was more a matter of knowing that there were certain kind of skill sets and my areas of interest that I wanted to focus on rather than being a lawyer per se. It was that I was a good public speaker. I had a big inclination towards analytical reasoning, logical reasoning. So I felt that a natural fit for me would be law. So it wasn't like a very focused decision that I want to be a lawyer. One day I got up and decided that. It was more that it fit in very well with my skill set. So I think that was the reason. My interest in law actually started after I joined law school.
Moving forward, you work as an investment expert with the Energy Charter Secretariat, which I think is a massive achievement. Uh, can you tell us more about the Energy Charter Treaty? What is its primary purpose and why is it important as a treaty?
Okay, so the Energy Charter Treaty is the only multilateral legal instrument that regulates exclusively investments in the energy sector, and it was formulated. It came into force at a time in the post-Soviet period after there were a lot of these Western European investors who wanted to invest in resources that were based in Central Asian countries and in the post-Soviet countries. So it was a kind of conduit, a legal conduit between the East and the West. So in terms of first furthering international relations, furthering energy cooperation, furthering energy security, it plays a very, very important role. The provisions of the treaty primarily relate to, first, there are the hardcore investment related provisions, which grant most favored nation, fair and equitable treatment, these kind of protections to investors. And then it also has provisions on dispute resolution between contractors and then also between the investor and the host state. So dual provisions in that sense.
Right.
And it also has provisions protecting, promoting energy efficiency. There is a whole protocol on this.
Right. So, ma'am, and what about your role with the Secretariat? Like, what are your primary responsibilities as an investment expert?
So as you rightly mentioned, I work in the investment unit, and my task and my team's task is to ensure the implementation of these investment provisions by the member countries. Then we also try to promote and facilitate investments in the energy sector in our member constituency, in the Energy Charter constituency. We assist governments and give them recommendations and technical assistance on how to get more investments in the right areas, in the much needed areas of the energy sectors. And we try to help them, assist them with making the correct policies and structuring and helping them out with furthering their legal and regulatory framework in this respect.
Right. And I think as a part of your responsibility, you have played a very huge role in the formation of the Secretariat's flagship publication, which is titled Energy Investment Risk Assessment. Can you tell us more about the publication per se? what are the type of risks that you take into account while preparing the report?
Yeah, so I think one of my primary tasks is managing and leading the development of this report, Energy Investment Risk Assessment Report. And we started with this in the year 2016, and its first public version came out in 2018. And the
Right.
purpose of this report is to help our member and observer countries to understand specific types of legal and regulatory risks that
Right.
can affect investments in their country in the energy sector, and to
Right.
give them areas for improvement so that they can, take the necessary action, timely action to fill the gaps and
Right.
to get more, mobilize more financing for their energy
Right.
sector.
Okay.
What are the main risks we look at? There are actually three risks. The
Okay.
first is the risk of unpredictable policy and regulatory change. Now, in this era of clean energy transition, we see a lot of countries are taking efforts and measures to move to more clean investments.
Right.
This is require a lot of structural changes also to the policy frameworks, to the legal frameworks, to the regulatory framework. And what is needed is for governments to have a very predictable and progressive approach towards these
Right.
changes. You cannot undertake suddenly a change in your laws and regulations in one day. You have to
Right.
do it now, and you need to start taking steps in the right direction. You need to
Right.
have a long term game plan. So, we see a lot of countries, for example, coming up with policies for 2050, 2070.
Right.
You need to have an end game. So
Right.
what we try to do is minimize the risk of any unpredictable changes that will suddenly impact investors in the energy
Right.
sector. We advise
Right.
governments to take progressive small steps from day one. So this
Right.
is the one risk we look at, whether there is any predictability or any changes, sudden changes in the legal and regulatory framework.
All right.
Uh, the second risk we look at is the risk of discrimination between foreign investors. Here we
Okay.
primarily look at the regulatory regime, how much competition there is in the market. We look
Right.
at what are the kind of restrictions that are imposed exclusively on foreign investors in these countries, and try and
Right.
explain to governments how they can reduce these kind of restrictive measures and practices.
Right.
We also look at local content requirements in the sector.
Okay.
And basically, this is the second risk area that we look at.
Okay.
And the third area is breach of state law obligations. One focuses primarily on the respect for property rights, which means that whether the countries are taking enough measures to guarantee and safeguard the private property and also the not just real but also intellectual property of energy
Right.
investors from
Right.
expropriation, from whether it is direct or indirect. What are the measures in place to facilitate investor-state dispute settlement? Whether there are provisions that facilitate access to international arbitration? Is
Right.
mediation allowed between the investor and the state? Is there an investment ombudsman who can, resolve conflicts when the operations are going on instead of coming in at the last stage? So there are different steps that we look at, and if a country has
Right.
all the right mechanisms in place, we give them, we call them strengths. And if they don't have the right mechanisms in place, we try to advise them on how to put the right institutional policy frameworks in place.
Right. This is actually very interesting, and I just have a very small question related to this report. What kind of a methodology you follow? Like, is it a survey-based mechanism? Is it a survey-based methodology, or how do you actually go about it in very, very general terms?
So what we do is that we're one of the very few reports that actually get direct information through a questionnaire from
Okay.
governments. So we work with a focal ministry.
Okay.
It is assigned by the government itself. They assign one ministry that we work, and they provide us their input through, like you said, a questionnaire, a survey,
Right.
and we get that. And then apart from that, we invite a set of external partners who can be, for example, independent law firms, they can be
Okay.
financial institutions, they can be academia or chamber of commerce, and all of these different agencies and bodies, they send us independently the questionnaire, so that, at the risk of not being a self-assessment by governments, And then based on
Right.
all the input that we do within the secretariat, we do a fact finding, a data verification, a data research check. And once we've developed all of this and we have a consolidated version of what is the actual status, what are the correct answers for all of the surveys, through all of the surveys, then we develop a 4-page profile of the country, which
Okay.
is again circulated to all our external partners, to the government for approval. So it's a very
Right.
collaborative exercise. The purpose is not to rank countries because we want to help them, we want to
Yeah.
assist and support them. So we work with the government, with their support, always involving the ministries at every stage to ensure that whatever suggestions we give can actually be implemented by them. We don't want to give
Right.
unrealistic kind of ideas to them.
Right. And now moving forward to more, more focal issues which fall in the realm of energy law and policy. We often hear that, we often hear this debate around energy investments and, their impacts on communities and the society. So in your opinion, how can the investors meet these societal expectations regarding, cultural expectations, societal expectations, it, benefiting the public, kind of an expectation that is usually placed on them? How do you think they can, meet these expectations?
I mean, to be fair, I think already there are a lot of companies which have set a kind of path that other companies can follow upon. And my example would be Total Energies. You have
Right.
BP, you have Shell. These
Yeah.
were branded some time ago as hardcore oil and gas companies. But in the past few years, we've seen that they have heavily diversified their portfolios to increase
Right.
clean energies. Another
Right.
company is the Norwegian company Statoil, which is now
Right.
because it is investing in clean energy. Some of them have also pledged GHG emission cuts. So
Right.
we see that investors themselves are taking a lot of initiative to move to clean energy. They understand the responsibility which is upon them.
Right.
We also see a lot of international financial institutions, for example, the EBRD, the European
Right.
Investment Bank, the International Finance Corporation. All of them have these requirements of environmental and societal performance standards that they have set for their
Right.
clients that they must meet in terms of protection, environment protection. We see governments uh,
Right.
framing laws which prohibit human rights violations by multinational corporations, two examples being France and the Netherlands. So,
Right.
already on a number of fronts, whether it is through the investor, whether it is through the multinational agencies, we are already
Right.
seeing that a lot of work is being done in this area. But
Right.
one simple golden thumb rule
Right.
is consultations, stakeholder
Right.
engagement at every step of the way by the
Right.
governments and by the companies that are undergoing to undertake projects.
Right.
This is the most critical aspect because no matter how grand your project is, if the community where it is going to actually where your operations will run, if the community
Right.
is not engaged, if they are not getting any benefits out of it, if they are not going to get any rewards from it, if what is going to happen
Right.
is just a lot of chaos, no benefit,
Right.
then it's not good. Then you will never get success in that project.
Absolutely.
And nor will it be very financially feasible because in the end, you will end up with a lot of decommissioning problems when you are
Right.
finished your operations and you're leaving. So, consultation and inclusion of communities at every stage of the project is very important on the part of the investor. Similarly, on the part of the
Right.
government, is
Right.
sharing of revenues. Sometimes what we
Right.
see is that everything goes to the revenue of the national governments, but you also need to share revenues with the local governments. So a good,
Right.
clear allocation of the revenues that
Right.
benefits the communities, the municipal and the provincial level governments get some money, some
Right.
returns. These are the kind of things that the governments can also do. So
Right.
inclusion is going to
Right.
be a very important factor. And we must understand that not only the fact that communities that are affected are very, very aware of their rights, that's a very important
Right.
factor now. With the social media age, everybody knows everything. But
Right.
at the same time, it's also important to understand that there are a lot of peer groups
Right.
that are aware, are going to push for these agendas, push for the rights of the
Right.
communities. So we need to take into account that it's not anymore a money making exercise,
Right.
especially with the Paris Agreement, climate change issues, adaptation and mitigation. One cannot just conduct any kind of operations and exclude communities and the environment altogether.
Right. And I think you make a very, very relevant point here. Like, what people usually are not very aware and are not working in the field of energy investments, what they see is that these companies are not only dealing with national governments where they're investing, or in the particular countries and the official organizations that are there, but they're also dealing with communities, because at the end of the day, that is the place and these are the people you will have to interact with, in more frequent terms than the government. And it's very, I think, important to develop that trust and confidence with that particular community, so that the efficiency of your entire investment and your work there can increase, and it can actually benefit people there. So I think that's a very, very relevant point. And while reading about the Secretariat's work, I also I got to know that a few years ago, in one of the meetings, the agenda was related to fossil fuels and how we can reduce the use of fossil fuels. So my next question is directly related to that. How do you think that all parties in the coming times, we see these, as you rightly mentioned, goals for 2030, 2040, which are theoretically very good, but how do you think in practical terms can all parties, actually move towards better energy efficiency and reduce the use of fossil fuels?
So again, I would like to start by saying that of all the countries that we see, for example, even if you look at the Energy Investment Risk Assessment report, you will
Right.
find that so many of them have set binding national level targets for
Right.
renewable energy power generation,
Right.
energy efficiency targets,
Right.
GHG emission cuts. A lot of them have set long-term plans, 2050 plans for their energy transition. So we see that a lot of work is being done in this respect already. Some countries have even gone one step ahead. For example, like Colombia, which has
Right.
set specific in its laws legally binding targets for in public transportation. This is very unique.
Right.
We have Croatia that has set targets for 2050 with a view to 2070. So you can imagine the kind of vision countries have right now. And
Right.
this is all due to their obligations under the Paris Agreement and the international obligations that come stem from that for climate change adaptation and mitigation. So
Right.
we do see that there is a lot of political commitment in this sense. One area that will require additional efforts is actually the fossil fuel cut targets. This is one
Right.
area which needs to be worked upon because phasing out of fossil fuels, having a deadline for that is very, very important. Countries need to come up with a specific deadline by which they will stop using fossil fuels altogether. For example, Greece has already done that.
Right.
There are a number of EU countries that have already done that. So this is going to be a very important game changer because while we can talk about stepping up renewable energy power generation, if it is not
Right.
going to be, there is no commensurate reduction in fossil fuel generated energy.
Right.
It's a balancing game. You have to increase one and
Right.
decrease the other. So
Right.
a more binding kind of targets in terms of and binding deadlines for phasing out fossil fuels is important. Of course, always bearing in mind the national development context of the countries as well, which is very important. So, of
Right.
course, they need that in mind as well before they commit to any kind of reductions. But it is very important to have these kind of deadlines for sure.
Right.
Phasing out coal, finding, for example, countries that want to phase out coal, a lot of them have already committed to that. But in terms of actual implementation, this can be a
Right.
problem. They need to find the right kind of alternative occupations for the people who are heavily invested
Right.
in this particular field. They also need to find alternative revenue sources if their state budgets, state revenues are highly reliant on coal. So alternatives need to be worked out at this stage for countries that have already set targets as well. So
Right.
I think on the implementation level, this is an area that will need some more work, because I think in terms of increasing renewable power generation, at least power generation, I would say a lot of countries are already quite committed to that.
Right. I think this was very, very insightful, ma'am. Like, this was not, which is very much there in common knowledge. And I think this was very important in terms of an answer as well. I think this was very insightful in terms of an answer because these are some points that are not available in common knowledge, and people actually, need to, audience generally needs to know about them as to how, in practical terms, fossil fuel, the use of fossil fuels can be reduced. And with this, I would like to move on to the last part and the last question of this conversation. And this is something I ask to almost all of the experts we host on our platform. Uh, what is your advice to young professionals and students who are, who are wanting to pursue a career in energy law, particularly in international energy law? What is your advice to them based on your experience?
So I would say that, I mean, energy law as a subject is still evolving. It's pretty new, and it was basically all covered. For example, if you know contracts, then you can
Right.
work on all kinds of contracts. Energy contracts or power purchase agreements being the same, or if you know arbitration, it's fine, it's the same. But with
Right.
the coming into being of the Paris Agreement, with clean energy transition gaining so much of momentum, and renewable energy and energy efficiency gaining priority, I think
Right.
this has become a whole field in itself. So my advice to anybody who wants to work in this field would be, first, work as much as possible with any kind of organizations that are working in this
Right.
field. If possible, try and get some experience with law firms, or try and get some experience in policy making organizations, think tanks that work on these kind of issues. I would say that it's a kind of risk, in the sense that
Right.
I agree that this is a very interesting field, but it's also a very niche field.
Right.
So, for example, my whole CV is streamlined in one direction. I've always
Right.
known. So be sure that this is what you want to do, because it's a very niche field, very interesting field. But read as much as possible. Try and see if you
Right.
have that kind of interest in it. Work as much as possible with companies that have that work on construction of these kind of
Right.
projects, and once that has happened, then slowly and steadily you can build on. And I mean, that's from my personal experience I'm speaking. I first work on the national level, then I
Right.
got an opportunity on the international level. So you have to build slowly on it, and the best way to do work around it is to get as much of exposure in whatever. There's no particular organization where you need to work. You can get exposure anywhere at any level,
Right.
as long as it's in that particular field.
Right. I absolutely agree, ma'am. I think that there are 3 points which we can take from this advice. First is to focus upon the basics, contracts, and what are the basics of policy making. I think that are very important. Secondly, is to work with the organizations, companies, or firms which are actually working in this area. And I think many law firms in India right now, some of the top tier law firms have a dedicated energy law practice, and I think that can be a very good hands-on exposure. And third is to be convinced that this is something that you would like to focus on. And I think that's very important. With this, we come to an end of this conversation. It was absolutely wonderful, ma'am, to host you once again, and it was very insightful. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Shashwat and Contemporary Law Forum, for inviting me, and it was a pleasure for me as well.